Good afternoon or good morning, depending on when you will see this video. Welcome to a further interview of the Identities Society in Berlin. As you know, we've launched this series of interviews with relevant stakeholders, individuals that are active in the world of cultural diplomacy on different levels and in different ways. Today we have a new guest connected from Austria who will be telling us his point of view on quite a wide spectrum of questions that will be posed by Davide Sirna, who will be speaking after me. Let me briefly synthesize who we are. The Dante Alighieri Society in Berlin is part of a network of hundreds of committees in the world. We are linked to our headquarters in Rome, and our objective and mission is to promote the Italian language and culture while creating, of course, bilateral and multilateral cultural bridges with the cities, communities, and countries where our committees are located in. I am Luigi Mercuri, president of the society in Berlin, and thank you, the guests today, for joining us. Davide, the floor is yours. Please tell us who we have the pleasure of welcoming today.
Hello, everyone. So today we're here with Professor Hans Köchler, who is actually with us from Austria, and we're going to conduct a short interview about the meaning of the word civilization and about all the identity dilemmas that have arisen in the last decades when it comes to global civilizations and local civilizations, or Weltanschauung, as we will see during the interview. First of all, Professor Köchler, it is a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for joining us in this difficult period because of the COVID pandemic. So the first question will be about global civilization and identity. So a word that has been object of great discussion and often controversies in the last decades is with no doubt globalization, and a vast plethora of meanings attached to this term. Even though the world has become more and more interconnected and many global areas of cities, which is culturally heterogeneous and diverse areas, have appeared on the map, it's just worth mentioning cities like Berlin, where we are based, Paris, Amsterdam, New York, and perhaps even Hong Kong. Even though we have become much more interconnected and diversity has become something that sometimes is taken for granted, we still hear quite often of a certain culturally based division, rise in intolerance. And we can see that even in Europe in the growth of many far-right political parties in some cases. And only know, to quote your article, a series of Weltanschauung conflicts. We can all agree that, the starting point is to be located in the identity threat perceived by many, especially the older generations, but not only, which is posed by an increasing diversity, both at a cultural or civilizational level. How do you believe, from a, let's say, philosophical point of view, identity and difference, universality and diversity can be reconciled in the case of a citizen living in a multicultural area like Berlin, for instance?
My view of identity is based on a scheme of the dialectics of consciousness. That's how I would call it. I can only know who I am. I can only position myself as a subject, to speak philosophically, if I'm able to relate to something which is different from myself. That is the Fichtean subject-object dialectics, which later determined an entire school of philosophy in Germany. So without this duality of the I and the non-I, the subject and the object, there is no reflection, there is no consciousness. And in that sense, in that very basic and structural sense, there can be no cultural or civilizational identity unless the community to which I belong, the cultural or civilizational community to which I belong, is able to relate to another such community or identity. That is the philosophical framework in general. The problem is in under the circumstances of globalization, as you have already hinted at, because nowadays there is a totally new situation compared, for instance, to the situation in earlier centuries when Christianity was, for instance, the Christian Western civilization was interacting with Islam. Now, the difference, the other, so to speak, is not geographically distant, far away, and it does not exist just in the form, for me, of reading books and obtaining information from other civilizations, reading their literature. It determines the day-to-day reality in my own place, locally, and that is the difference. And that has created also numerous problems in terms of psychology and of sociology. It is easy, I would say, to relate to some cultural identity or some cultural community that is far away and with which we can communicate through exchanges in terms of literature and scholarly research. And it is much more difficult to deal with cultural differences at the moment, right at the place where we live. And that's the challenge now, because diversity is not just anymore a reality that exists at the global level, but a reality that exists every day and every moment at the local level. And this has been a structural situation is a direct result of the globalization, which we in the West have brought about ourselves. This is because of the rapid development of technology, and because of our interest in improving the standard of life. I mean, it's a combination of economic interests and scientific industrial development that has brought us into that phase of globalization.
And do you believe more identities can cohabit in one individual? In one, let's refer again to the already mentioned citizen of a multicultural area or cosmopolitan city like Berlin. Do you think that more identities can cohabit in one single person? Of course, we know that there are many other identities around us that, will define the I, the Fichten I. But in one single person, without going, out of this individual, how can many, identities that can be, based on different languages or religion or even, belonging to some minority groups, how can they cohabit in one individual? And if we take a step further, in one society as a whole, so for example, saying that Berlin is not only a German city, but something more.
In my experience, I can only speak on the basis of my experience since my youth, since the student years. What is important is that the individual reaches with his own or her own specific horizon of understanding, what Husserl called the Thelebensberg, the life world, reaches out to other such horizons of understanding. And for me, if I remember my student years, one of the most fascinating aspects of studies was to get acquainted with non-Western traditions. I almost felt betrayed by the educational system in my country or in Europe in general, because I had only learned about our own tradition, going back to the Romans and Greeks and to the Christian heritage, but no further. So we were taught, and when I met at this time, that was in the late 60s, early 70s, when I met students, colleagues from Asia or Africa or the Arab world, I felt completely ignorant in comparison to them, because they knew much more about our Western civilization naturally because of colonization. They had been educated in our way of life, while we were almost totally ignorant. about Islam, about Hinduism, about Confucianism, and so on. And that relates, of course, to all the different levels of culture, not only to the language and literature, it relates also to music, to aesthetical perceptions, and so on. And for me, it has always been very important to broaden my horizon in that regard, also in terms of aesthetical perception. And I have learned that aesthetical perceptions in terms of music, for instance, but also in terms of a painting can be rather different depending on the civilizational horizon. And if you take, for instance, the big difference between Islamic art and our European Renaissance-like understanding of art, which is shaped by the Greek tradition. And unless I am aware of these differences, I would say I'm not, I cannot be a mature self, but there is one important thing, and this is my philosophical position on the basis of Kant and his transcendental philosophy. The self-awareness of a person centers around a core that you may call the subject, subjectum, that which is laying, or which is the basis, or in Greek, hypokeimenon. And that, in my view, will remain. If it does not remain, and if it is split, then we have a kind of schizophrenia. Of course, this also is a reality of life in many cases, in different degrees. But in general, I would say there is always one point of reference. This is the subject that has been brought up in the framework of a certain tradition, but that subject may be able to relate to other life worlds, to other horizons, to other areas of perceptions of other individuals or communities of other individuals. And in that sense, it will just appreciate a kind of diversity. It will learn to see the world under the aspects of, for instance, Asian civilization or indigenous civilizations. We can learn a lot also from indigenous civilizations in Africa or in South America in terms of perception of nature, for instance. But it does not mean that there will be two egos within myself. If someone feels this with a certain intensity, that there are different egos in his personal structure, this might lead to tensions. But in my view, dealing with the fact that there are people with different identities or different cultural horizons living in one space of a city and so on, this does not necessarily lead to a kind of split personality as far as the individual is concerned. The problem is, how can we prevail? How can a tolerant attitude prevail? An attitude that is shaped by intellectual curiosity, by a desire to know about, to know more about the world, to know more about perceptions of life, which is, by the way, essentially a scholarly attitude. That's what motivated me also to proceed to to academic studies. And it does not imply that the different aspects of life which I try to find out about and about which I communicate with others will necessarily lead to confrontation or rejection. Of course, there is one problem, and that's about values and about lifestyles determined by values. That is maybe the most difficult and complicated problem right now in our multicultural societies in Europe.
Well, thank you for this enlightening answer. From a personal point of view, I can, rely myself to what you said before. I've also experienced let's say, cultural shame when meeting people from Eastern Africa that actually come to study in my country, because first of all, they spoke my language extremely well. They knew so much about my culture, my, even local traditions, and I was amazed, because that's, of course, because of colonialism. But I felt, a good amount of shame, because I knew basically not so much about Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. I really felt extremely, ignorant compared to the amount of knowledge they had on my country and my traditions. Anyway, the third question, first of all, it's going to lead us to the Dante Alighieri Society's objectives and, programs. So the Dante Alighieri Society was born with intention to promote the Italian language and culture in the world. It was founded after the Italian unification by the Italian poet and patriot Giosuè Carducci, and had the aim to promote and spread the Italian language, literature, and culture around the world. So it is just from here where I would like to start the next question. If we take a step back into history, we might remember that in the aftermath of the Italian political unification in 1861, the Italian patriot Massimo d'Azeglio pronounced a famous sentence: "Abbiamo fatto l'Italia, ora dobbiamo fare gli italiani." We made Italy, now it's about time to make the Italians. And in recent times, a few years ago, more or less after the Brexit referendum and the increase of popularity of parties like the French Front National or the Italian Lega Nord, someone in the European political elites rephrased this sentence into, we made Europe, now it's about time to make the Europeans. Wir haben Europa geschafft, jetzt sollten wir die Europäer schaffen. So if we want to take this a step further, saying that Europe will one day be more compact, even though we have to admit that the recent behavior shown by many European countries during the COVID crisis showed quite the opposite. But if we would like to be optimistic and take this a step further and imagine the creation of a hypothetical global society, a compact global society based on a strong global cultural identity, how could we achieve a compact global civilization without losing our cultural roots and traditions, which is something that has already happened, to a certain extent. If we think about what has happened with many languages, especially in the European continent, many languages have, let's say, not been lost, but they're on a death road. If we think of, for example, the Scandinavian languages, once there used to be a common Scandinavian jargon, or even called Scandinavisk språk, so Scandinavian language used by Norwegians, Swedes, and Danes. It was a mix of many of all the Scandinavian languages, and it used to be, let's say, lingua franca for a very specific region of the world, which nowadays doesn't exist anymore because people are using English to communicate. And we can also see the same in many other European countries. If we ever look at the countries of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, the use of German is not the same that, as it used to be back in the day. And even if we look at, certain cases, like, for example, the Czech Republic and the Republic of Slovakia, once there used to be a so-called Czechoslovak language, which now doesn't exist anymore. And to my great surprise, people my generation are nowadays using English to communicate. So people from the Czech Republic and Slovakia using English, which is a third language. And I myself, as a Romance-speaking person, I can feel the same where I encounter people from France or South America, then instead of relying on Spanish or French, or a mix of these languages, they choose to speak English. And it's also an irony that we're conducting this interview in English, but still. So what's your take on this topic?
This is really one of the major problems of the state under conditions of globalization. I personally would not follow a policy that is aimed at creating an artificial European man or European identity. We have diversity in Europe to really in a very important historical sense, and in a very important sense as regards culture, philosophy, and the most refined aspects of life, so to speak. And I would not want to risk that for a kind of artificial new identity. My point is that we should not structure trans or intergovernmental structures, whether this is the European Union or any other union, African Union, or Association of Southeast Asian Nations, according to the model of the nation state. Europe is not a nation state. Italy is a nation state. Germany is a nation state in the traditional sense. And I would analyze or describe the problem from the basis of the traditional sovereign nation state. Just take my small country, Austria. Even Austria consists of different cultural communities. We are not only German-speaking citizens, we also have Hungarian-speaking citizens, and we have, along the southern border, also Slovenian-speaking citizens. And I do not expect the Hungarians, and Croatians also, not to forget, also Croatian communities we have. I do not expect the Hungarians, the Croatians, and the Slovenians to subscribe 100% to the cultural identity of the German-speaking community of Austria. So I have always made this distinction, which I introduced first time I remember in Bologna, maybe more than 20 years ago, at a meeting with Stanford University. I would distinguish between citizenship and cultural identity. So my point is, I'm a citizen of the Republic of Austria, like the members of the Hungarian, Slovenian, Croatian groups. But at the same time, I belong to a community that the identity of which is shaped in regards to another language, not Croatian, not Slovenian, but German. And it should be possible, if we make this distinction, to live together peacefully on the basis of equal rights. Every person has equal rights as a citizen, and that includes also the right to express his or her cultural or national identity, so to speak. And if we deal with the wider framework of this intergovernmental, partly now, as it seems, also a supranational structure of the European Union, we must preserve the same approach. There are many different national and cultural identities, and according to the arrangements that exist, or to other arrangements that may exist in the future, we have certain rights as citizens living on the territory of this entity, which is called European Union, but this does not make us artificial citizens. That does not give us an artificial nation-state identity of Europe, as I will not have an artificial nation-state identity of the Vatican, should I ever happen to live there, and should I ever be granted that privileged citizenship, that privileged passport of Città del Vaticano. That does not make me a member of the Vatican nation. So one should make such these distinctions, which I consider very important. And universalism, this is another big question now. Universalism, in terms of being a citizen of my country or being a citizen in the European Union, or I may say also globally, being a world citizen, being a citizen of the globe, does not contradict the specificity and the uniqueness of my personal cultural identity as a member of the German community, or for instance, the Italian community, and so on. And as far as Italy is concerned, I fully support the noble goals of the Dante Alighieri Society. The Italian culture and the Italian history, Italian cultural identity, that is what dominates in the Republic of Italy. But it's not the only culture. There is also, if I may speak as I'm from Tyrol, there is also a German-speaking community in Alto Adige, for instance, and there are other communities that speak even more ancient languages, as you know. And I do not see any contradiction between citizenship of a sovereign. I prefer the term sovereign state instead of nation state, but traditionally, if one says nation state, one means the state as a sovereign entity, as a sovereign actor on the basis of equality at the global level. And on the other hand, there is a number of specific identities. There may be an identity related to the culture, related to the language one belongs to, but there are other identities related to the religion, related to very specific personal preferences and so on. And in a democratic society where the rule of law prevails, the state should be neutral vis-à-vis the personal identities, but at the same time, it is also a reality that in most states, not all, but in most states, because of the history of the state, there is a majority cultural identity that is usually related to languages, may also be in certain cases related to religion, which in Europe we do not understand anymore because we have become so much secular that we do not have any sensibility for what religious identity and religious awareness means. And we think everybody all over the world must live exactly in the same secular lifestyle as we in the meantime do.
Well, I'd like to thank you for mentioning some of Italy's minorities. I also know many members of the Albanian Irish minority, which lives in many regions of Southern Europe, Calabria and Sicily. It is Albanians that have fled to Italy before the Ottoman invasion more than 500 years ago and the defeat of the legendary Captain Skanderbeg. And they have maintained their own language, their traditions, and still nowadays they do speak the Irish Albanian language, but at the same time they consider themselves Italians of Albanian ethnicity or language, and of course proud citizens of the Italian state. So we can see that many identities can cohabit in one person or one individual in many cases. So
if I may add a point, let's look at the United States. I mean, there are Italian American, Polish Americans, Japanese Americans have clear own cultural identities, but feel absolutely part of the community and feel their citizenship and actually their duty towards the country in a very strong way as well.
Yes, and if I may add, one feels part of the community of the citizens of the state if the rights of one's communities are respected on the basis of equality. That is the basic issue. In states where certain cultural communities are not properly respected, or where their status is not adequately recognized by the state, there we have the problem of loyalty, or of the lack of loyalty.
We can see this, for example, in the case, it used to be the case of South Tyrol, because in the, let's say, aftermath of the First World War, German was unfortunately, forbidden language because of fascism. And many people had to learn their own language in South Tyrol in the so-called Katakombenschulen. So Katakombenschulen, there were schools they were, you know, let's say, kept in secret because of the fascist police and you know, severe restrictions. But we can see that now the case is, you know, the situation has changed, and we can see that in South Tyrol people are bilingual. So it is also a great example to see how a region that used to be extremely diverse and kind of distant from Rome in this case has become a great region. First of all, quite successful from an economic point of view, but also from a cultural point of view, a really Mitteleuropäisch region that can be, you know, a model for many other minorities, linguistic and cultural minorities. So talking about indeed tolerance, how do you think we can manage our own cultural identity at the same time while being tolerant and open when we're confronted with new identity or diversity? And I'm not talking about European cultures, because if we look at, again, for example, at the Austrian or German-speaking now Italians and the Belgians, so the Italians that came from the south to South Tyrol, all in all, they both speak Indo-European languages. Now, indeed, it's a bilingual region. They both are Christians, and they also, you know, their traditions developed in a very similar context, and they've always been neighbors, so they've always known each other. But when we are confronted with new traditions or new Weltanschauung coming perhaps from other continents, we've seen in Europe sometimes, you know, an increase in intolerance and sometimes even racism in some areas. We've seen episodes of intolerance and sometimes even violence. So from a philosophical point of view, how do you think we can manage to maintain our own identity while embracing such a new one, a different Weltanschauung, and still understand it and respect it, even if it is extremely distant from our own?
Yeah, that's the most difficult problem nowadays, and particularly here in Europe, because the composition of the demographic composition has changed in practically every state. Germany, for instance, was more or less a homogeneous state in terms of demography, ethnically, I mean. And nowadays that is not so anymore. Nowadays there is a rather considerable multitude of ethnic communities, also a rather considerable diversity in terms of religious identities. And the problem is that each of those identities, especially in terms of religion, whether it is Islam, particularly, I mean, that's the hottest issue now, or Christianity, or I would say now the secular religion, because in Europe, let's be frank, at least in Austria, that's the case. There is no real Christian awareness anymore. This is more or less an ornament and a facade, but the average person here has not the least knowledge about the teachings of Christianity. Here, the religion in the meantime, or the doctrine, or the ideology is that of secularism, but that also comes with a certain very specific set of values. And the problem is that each of us is brought up in such a way, whether in a religious tradition A or religious tradition B, or non-religious tradition like secularism, that the worldview associated with this position is also implying very specific values. That means norms, how we should behave, norms, what we should consider appropriate behavior, and so on. And that relates to so many different fields, including for instance, dress code, including views of what is decent and what is not decent in public, including views on family relations. This is also a very important issue. And there is almost no common point between a traditional, for instance, a traditional religious attitude, which cherishes the family and which cherishes the traditional partnership between male and female, and so-called fashionable postmodern perceptions of family, or of the non-existence of family, and of what is proper in one's behavior in society. These views or norms are not compatible, and the big problem now is globally, of course. First, globally, can the Western secular society really claim that the entire world should be reshaped according to our postmodern secular standards, gender values, or whatever? Can that be done? Is it justified or not? It is neither is it justified nor is it realistic. It just will not happen. China will not endorse this system of values. The Muslim world will not do so, and many other cultural environments, including also India, for instance, will not go along. The problem is how to deal with this at the state level, at the local level. And here, I think we have not yet found a solution. But one thing is a lost case, so to speak, or a lost cause. If the state thinks that it can pontificate about other cultural identities. If you take Islam, this is the hottest issue, the most delicate issue. The state, the government, the Minister of Interior or the intelligence service cannot decide what the proper form of that or any other religions is. I would also, in terms of my being a member of the Roman Catholic Church, I would not authorize the Minister of Interior of Austria or the police boss of Austria to define for me what the proper interpretation of religion is. So it would just not work. And that's the situation we are faced with now. It is easy to give philosophical advice, and for someone whose how should I say, self-understanding is essentially based along intellectual lines, it should not be a problem. For me, it is not difficult to accept that there live other communities in our midst who cannot appreciate, for example, certain aesthetical perceptions on our side, whether it's in terms of music or, let's say, paintings and so on. Because, for instance, in Islam, it is it is considered forbidden to depict creatures of God. That means human beings or even animals, living creatures. It is forbidden, so there cannot be any art in that area. There can only be art in terms of ornaments. And I can, if I know the origins of this particular understanding or value, for me it is no problem to live with that. I do not insist to instill my own aesthetical perceptions into someone who is from a totally different background. But of course, the main thing here is reciprocity. This can only work if the other person with another identity living in the state I'm a citizen of adopts the same attitude and will not consider himself or herself a missionary for his own worldview, and will not try to convert me, as I will not try to convert others to my own philosophy or lifestyle. But the problem is that a state does not consist mainly of people with a philosophical mind, and that's why we have all these conflicts and confrontations, and why there is now such a poisoned climate, which is particularly the case in Austria, where the government has set up a special monitoring office in regards to organizational activities of other religious communities and so on. That causes a lot of tension, and it's difficult as soon as one has started to go on that way. It's very soon to get out of this. Now we are in a very confrontational mindset in many of the states in Europe. I don't know about Italy, but in Austria it is so.
Unfortunately, we happen to be in a very similar situation. There's still a huge gap between the so-called, Christian or Catholic Italians and many other minorities, especially the new refugees that have come from Africa and other parts of the world. There is still a huge gap, and this is instrumentalized quite a lot by many politicians. So, but I believe it's a very common, let's say, scenario in many European countries. We can only hope the cosmopolitan values will spread in the future, especially nowadays we have universities, and not only universities, that encourage communication through programs such as Erasmus, for instance, or even programs that take their students or even workers or even young entrepreneurs to other countries, to other societies to explore new Weltanschauungen and so on. So the last question I'd like to ask you is about the work of societies such as the Dante Alighieri. For example, we could mention the Goethe Institute, Alliance Française, Instituto Cervantes, and many others. Do you think institutions like these ones could play a special role in globalizing societies and encourage transcultural relations?
They could be very important for what one can call a global dialogue between cultures and civilizations. I would define the role of such institutions, whether Dante Alighieri or Goethe. Even Austria has a small entity of what they call, I think, Österreichisches Kulturinstitut. The role of such institutions is not a kind of a propaganda or just a way to propagate one's culture and language and lifestyle, but it is a part, or I see it as part of a kind of exchange among different cultural identities. And in order to do that, it is important that each state has or engages in activities of exchange, whether this is, for instance, organizing exhibitions or symposia in different fields and so on, with people or with communities of other cultural identities in other states. That I would consider the productive role of cultural institutions like Dante Alighieri in today's global environment. And what is also very important is that a state does not underestimate the importance of this kind of work. If I look back now 40 years, we established the organization which I'm affiliated with, the IPO, almost 50 years ago. In this period, in the 1970s, as I remember, for instance, Germany had important activities also in the field of publishing and of making known German publications, German books to the outside world, a kind of review publication which was called German Studies. That and many other activities one just has abandoned. In my view, it's at the disadvantage of Germany, because nowadays, otherwise, if those countries that represent, so to speak, smaller cultural communities will just lose out in this borderless global environment. And that is the threat of uniformity, which I see that we are losing out, whether the Germans, the French, and all the other cultural communities to the English-speaking world. And for me, the Eurovision Song Contest is the best example of what may happen. 50 years ago, or even longer ago, every candidate presented the song in the national language, or in the language of his community, in his country. Now it is not in all cases, but in the vast majority of cases, it is just the same sing-along in English. And there is absolutely no diversity anymore. It's also the same taste or the same style in terms of music and rhythm. There is no uniqueness. It is all the Anglo-American trend. And for that reason, it is very important that the other cultures do make themselves heard and seen and known globally. And that is something which is far beyond just public relations or propaganda, or just an instrument of a diplomacy of the country.
Well,
And if I may say, it was a positive surprise then to see an Italian song in Italian win this year's edition, even though it's a rock song, which is again Anglo-American.
Yeah, I saw that in this particular case. I noticed that at least they were singing in Italian, but that to me was a surprise.
It's a start.
But the style was not the style in terms of melody and rhythm has absolutely nothing to do with Italian. And I regret so much, for instance, that there is never any song from, for instance, Napoli or the south of Italy. I know many songs from this part of your country, and they are so melodious and so precious in terms of musical quality, and they are very typical of the Italian tradition. But in the Eurovision framework, there is no chance, as it seems, for this really genuine aspect of Italian culture.
Who knows, one day a Napolitan tarantella might win Eurovision. Let's see and hope.
That I would really hope, would look forward to.
Well, Professor Köchler, let me say thank you for this great interview. It was a pleasure, and we're looking forward to see you in person in Berlin, once the situation will be kind of improved, and hopefully we can still go back to normality.
I hope too, and I did enjoy the conversation.